On to today's video, we'll be talking about the era of weak presidents and political corruption that played the period from the Compromise up until 1890. So we'll be able to describe who the weak presidents were, we'll be able to explain the impact of political corruption on their presidencies and how they combated it, or in this case didn't, and to evaluate whether the term weak is really deserved for these people. So the very first thing that we need to look at is the Compromise onwards. So the presidential reconstruction, congressional radical reconstruction, was over by March 1876, and we've got the election where Tilden's defeated and Hayes is elected on the proviso of removing troops. That's known as the Compromise of 1877, and that really is the basis for a lot of the period's corruption coming from this. So the political corruption started with the disputed election and the Compromise of 1877, but we've also got events such as the Tweed Ring, where William Boss Tweed was responsible for between $100 million and $200 million worth of fraud. He was obviously arrested along with other of his group, and that shook the electorate. They started to realise that the period was not as pure as perhaps they'd envisaged. We've also got southern corruption in this period. We've got the scalawags, the carpetbaggers and criminals. They arrange contracts, they commit fraud. There's opportunities to steal and bribe, and they become rich in the southern states as part of the Reconstruction deal, where we've got contracts being handed out to rebuild the cities that have been destroyed in the Civil War. It allowed some people to become very wealthy indeed, and the southern Democrats were very aware of this, and it was something that they wanted to tackle. And then we've got the patronage, or the spoils system. This is when elected officials gave positions in the civil service to supporters and contributors. We also look at pork barrel politics later on in the period. And lastly, the other reason for why there's corruption in this period that's not just isolated to political corruption is the cartels and trusts. These are large corporations and companies that join together to keep control of key markets. They include the beef market, for example, and they use their political capital to influence politicians in this period. And additionally, we've also got the impact on average Americans. They see these large businesses as working in their own interests, and it doesn't support the lower classes and the middle classes. So the very first president to be elected in this period is Rutherford Hayes, elected from 1877 to 81. He's a Republican. As promised, he was limited to one term in office. He had a very narrow victory. He was a lame duck, which meant that he had very little ability to change things, even if he wanted to. He led, his period was led to what became the Solid South, where the Democrats keep control in the southern states. He attempted to restore respectability to the presidency that had been affected under Ulysses Grant, and he kept his promise. He attempted to end the spoils system and patronage, but he was opposed by a group of Republicans called the Stalwarts, and we're going to look at them later as they become an increasingly powerful group that try and oppose any of the tackling of this political corruption. The next president we'll look at is James Garfield from 81. Sadly, he was assassinated, and we'll look at the impact of that assassination. He was nominated at the 1880 National Nominating Convention. Stalwarts supported Ulysses Grant to return for a third election bid. The Reformists, which was another part of the Republican Party, supported somebody called James Blaine, who was of the group the Half-Breeds, because they were half Republican and half other. Garfield was the dark horse, and he was nominated in the third round, the third ballot, and he won successfully. He then went to lead the Republican Party against the Democrat candidate Hancock, and also a third party led by Weaver known as the Greenback Party, and they wanted some changes to the monetary system in America at the time. He won 214 to 155, so quite a staggering victory. He repeatedly clashed with the stalwart faction of his party to reduce patronage. He appointed James Blaine, the person that he beat in the nominating convention, as Secretary of State, and that very much upset the stalwarts. He was shot in June 1881, and he took 2 months to die. He died in September 19th. He was replaced by his vice president, Chester Arthur, who was a stalwart. He was named as the running mate to James Garfield as kind of a consolidation to this powerful faction within the Republicans, the stalwarts. They were radical Republicans that wanted significant change. Chester Arthur took over, and he led the country from 81 to 85, again a Republican. He was vice president. He succeeded after the assassination, and he had a very negative perception. That's because he was a New York Republican, heavily tied into the scandals of the boss of the Tweed Ring and other scandals that were plaguing New York Republican Party at this time. During his presidency, though, he did get Congress to pass the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883. That led to a three-man commission that was going to appoint on merit jobs to the civil service. Indeed, in this period, 14 out of the 100,000 government positions were created by the Pendleton Civil Service. So rather than patronage, when victors handed out the jobs to the civil service jobs to their patrons and to people that had contributed, this time they were handing it out based on merit, and it was taken away. That power was partially taken away from the presidency. He had some success. Mark Twain has famously quoted as saying, "It would be hard indeed to better President Arthur's administration," but he was very much hindered by this negative perception, and that really is the only significant piece of legislation passed in his presidency. It led to the presidency of Grover Cleveland, and he's a Democrat, the first to be elected since 1868, and it was due to the support from immigrants and Southerners. He's of a faction known as the Bourbon Democrats. He opposed high tariffs. Now, tariffs were there to try and maintain high prices for imported goods, such as bourbon, whiskey. Whiskey was heavily taxed at different periods in American history, and that money went straight to the federal government rather than to the states. Other tariffs would have included when bringing in, say, cloth from different parts of the world. It meant that big businesses were faced with either paying high amounts of import duty, tariffs, or buying American, and so they often chose to buy American, and the companies that were selling these products then gained wealth through that. Now, the Southerners in the southern states did not like high tariffs. They were predominantly agricultural rather than manufacturing, so they were trying to buy materials from other parts of the world for cheaper in order to make their own amounts of their own profit. Grover Cleveland was elected on the promise to tackle corruption and to end the spoils system. What he did achieve in this period was a record number of vetoes, presidential vetoes, 414 in his presidency, more than twice as many as any of the other presidents in the previous period combined, and that's in part leading to his defeat to Harrison in 1889. He did have some success in tackling the political corruption in this period. He created the Interstate Commerce Commission. It regulated the powers of the railroads, and that pleased the farmers and agricultural industries. He continued the Chester Arthur's appointments on merits, and he tried to reduce government spending. But there was a panic of 1893 and led to a depression that lasted for 4 years until 1897, and he was unable to reverse it, and it's one of the reasons why he loses the presidency back to the Republicans. He then later goes on to win a second term and even a third term after the next president. So he had some success in dealing with the political corruption by creating the Interstate Commerce Commission, but was very much hindered by the panic of 1893. It led to the election of Benjamin Harrison from 89 to 93. He won a clear electoral majority of 233 to 168, but actually when you delve deeper into the numbers, he had 5,440,000, whereas Cleveland won 5,540,000. One of the reasons why Benjamin Harrison won was that he supported the Grand Army of the Republic. They were a group of veterans from the North, from the Civil War, and they wanted pensions and they wanted other benefits given to them. They did indeed get them. The Civil War veterans received pensions, they received purpose-built hospitals, and the big business received something called the McKinley Tariff of 1890, which we'll look at. One of the most significant pieces of legislation in this period that really does alienate a lot of the voters to the Republican Party, and it's going to be what leads to something known as the progressive movement or the populist movement. The other piece of legislation that's passed that does try and deal with the political corruption in this period is the Sherman Antitrust Act. It outlaws monopolies and big businesses that dominate. But, and there is a but, and we'll look at that on the next slide, Another thing in this period is 6 new states are admitted, and it shows the growth of the United States in this period. They are moving west and they are taking territories and turning them into states. At the end of his presidency, there was a $1 billion government. $1 billion for the first time had been appropriated. And America was very much now a country divided by wealth rather than class. And it's that distinction that's going to cause bigger problems. So, what were the McKinley Tariffs? And the McKinley Tariff of 1890 raised duties on virtually every import that competed with American products. There was an average rise of almost 50%, and it was introduced by William McKinley, who was a protectionist. He wanted to protect American industries. It was passed by the House of Representatives, 164 to 142, but faced stiff opposition from the Senate. After negotiation, the Republicans compromised, and it was passed on July the 4th, 1890. The Republicans compromised based on some pieces of legislation that meant they were going to be securing the dollar with silver rather than just the gold standard, and it's something that had been that Democrats had wanted for a long time. Manufacturers almost immediately raised their prices. They saw the opportunity to pass this on to the consumers, and therefore it was seen as a tax on the poor to benefit rich industries. So it contributed to this feeling of corruption in the Gilded Age. It gave the president, though, an important opportunity. One of the compromises was the president could raise duties if there was going to be a reciprocal duty, a tax with foreign nations to promote trade. Now, the ability to appropriate funds was closely guarded by American Congress, and this allowing the president to do this himself was giving up one of the major powers of Congress. So in summary, the McKinley Tariff raised import taxes, and it was there to protect American industries, but it badly affected American farmers, agriculture, and these prices were passed on to the average man, the average American, and it was going to lead to the progressive movement that we'll talk about in next few lectures. Lastly, we've got the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. This was one piece of legislation that tried to tackle some of the corruption in this period. It curbed and controlled industries such as oil, sugar, beef, where the lack of competition, the monopolies, hindered small and middle companies. Higher prices for the consumer, and it hit poor and middle class the hardest. So these monopolies were able to control the prices, and that meant that these high prices were passed on to the average American. Republicans generally, though, opposed this type of legislation, but the huge amount of popular demand for this kind of antitrust act led to it being passed by a Republican presidency in 1890. It said that every contract in the form of a trust or conspiracy to restrain trade is declared illegal, but it's very ambiguous. It fails to define trust. It fails to define what conspiracy is to restrain trade. Did it cover the railroads? Did it cover the unions? Nobody really knew. And so it was not an effective piece of legislation. It was the first piece of legislation that was going to try and break up these large businesses, monopolies, to try and break up the industries such as oil, sugar and beef, and also to deal with the railroad companies. But it was ambiguous. Nobody knew what it meant. And so the Gilded Age comes to a close in 1890, where you've got this series of weak presidents that fail to deal with the political corruption of the Tweed Ring, the political corruption of handing out positions in the civil service to people that have contributed to you. They've really failed to break up the domination of these large monopolies, and so the average American is on the march. They do want change, and it leads to the progressive movement. Thank you.